Hey, welcome back to Deep Dive Movie Reviews, the show where a Yank and a Brit sit around and talk about the latest films. James, what do we got on deck today?
So today we're talking about Marvel's Eternals. So this is the 26th film in the MCU now, and the second after Shang-Chi in Phase 4, which is a big step forward in sort of an exciting new direction for the franchise, because it seems to be laying the groundwork for the multiverse and for a whole roster of brand new characters. And following on from Shang-Chi, pretty much everybody in the Eternals is a character that we haven't seen and haven't experienced before. The film is directed by Oscar winner Chloe Zhao, who made one for Nomadland earlier this year. And essentially, it's the story of a group of immortal super beings called the Eternals, who have been living amongst us for the last 5,000 years, since the birth of human society and civilization, really. The idea is that they have been sent here by some sort of godlike beings called the Celestials to watch over the human race and protect them from the deviants, who are sort of, again, a sort of race of sort of human-eating monsters. We're unsure exactly of who they are to begin with, but it seems that about 500 years ago their work is done. They've conquered the deviants, and they are now allowed to lay down their arms and live happily among us, and they all interpret that in different things. The plot really picks up at the beginning of the movie, where an event causes an earthquake of sorts, causes the deviants to re-emerge, and that prompts the Eternals to reassemble and have to fight for the sake of the human race all over again.
Yeah, I went into this movie, James. Honestly, I don't think there's been a movie that I've gone into the cinema where I knew less about going in, other than it's an MCU movie and it's superheroes, but it didn't have Thor, didn't have Captain America, it didn't have who I instantly recognize. The only person I recognized was Angelina Jolie. Even Salma Hayek under the outfit, I didn't realize till I started watching the movie that, oh, that's Salma Hayek as well. But I thought this was a real hit. I mean, obviously, Marvel is trying to figure out, now that the Avengers is put on hiatus, they've kind of come to the conclusion of their great adventure. Where does this universe go? So they've introduced not only this new group of superheroes, but also an explanation of why they were largely absent for everything that's been going on crazy in the MCU for the last few years. And so my expectations were quite low. And because of that, I think, wow, this movie actually really worked for me. I mean, it introduced concepts, bigger concepts than I think we're used to in the MCU. It introduced some philosophical and moral arguments that I always enjoy in a film. It's not without its shortcomings, and it's long and it's a bit convoluted, but by and large, I thought Chloe Zhao did a really strong job in a difficult task.
Yeah, I mean, it comes at a sort of tricky time for the MCU, really, which hasn't been helped by COVID at all. I mean, the timing's been pretty abysmal in that regard. That they've come to the end of Phase 3, which is this great arc leading to, what was it called, the Infinity Saga, with Endgame. And you've got all of these characters who are now either dead or sort of quote-unquote retired, or have gone their separate ways. And you've got a lot of actors sort of out of contract. And probably too expensive to put back into contract. And so they're clearly, they know what they're doing structurally. I believe that. But they're really trying to like almost wipe the slate clean, while at the same time opening the scope of the MCU up to sort of the multiverse and sort of the intergalactic potential that has been explored, for decades and decades in the comic books. And the Eternals, as is my understanding, are quite a pivotal and significant part of that. I should introduce a caveat here that I'm not a particularly big comics guy. Since the MCU has started, I've tried to kind of just get an understanding of the bare bones of where this has all been coming from and where it's all going. But really, my knowledge of all of these characters in the MCU originates from the films. Previous incarnations of certain characters, but then just since 2008 onwards, really. And so coming into a film like Eternals, like yourself, I didn't know anything about them. I'd heard the elevator pitch that they're immortal beings living among us, and the reason that they haven't intervened thus far is that they only fight the deviants,
Right.
which I think is pretty flimsy as an excuse, but they get it out of the way. What I liked is that they broach the subject almost immediately. You know, in the first scenes, you've got Gemma Chan's character Cersei, sort of reveals who she is to her her human boyfriend Dane, played by Kit Harington, when they get attacked by a deviant in London, like right at the beginning of the film. And his first question is, well, why didn't you help fight Thanos? And she says, well, we've been sworn only to fight the deviants and to otherwise, stand back and let humanity take its course. And that seems to be... And then essentially what the film does is it's structured like a series of flashbacks looking back over the evolution of human civilization and how the Eternals have chosen to intervene, or more often not intervened.
Right.
But to kind of, just sort of nudge humanity in the right direction every now and again, while struggling with the fact that they're not supposed to do anything.
Right. And they're not... One of the things that kind of worked for me in this movie was they're not all in the same place on these moral dilemmas. Some of them are, hey, it's not our job to interfere. Yeah, we'd like to, but we can't. And others are like, no, we have the power to stop this evil. And it goes back to what you were saying about the it's a little flimsy, the idea of, sorry, we're only here to stop deviants. I mean, at the end of the day, deviants are like big grizzly bears or great white sharks. They eat the occasional human. So you've sent this super powered immortal race to Earth basically to stop grizzly attacks and great white shark attacks. There is greater evils that mankind has faced than CGI generated dogs. That was one of the things that didn't work for me. But the moral and philosophical concepts that were introduced, I mean, even the whole idea that, these are immortals, these are gods. So one of the eternal questions that we face is, if there is a God and he's all powerful, why does he allow evil? Well, this kind of actually deals with that, in that at one point, Barry Keoghan, his character, I think Druig, he has the ability to capture people's minds and change their emotions. And basically he can take a group of violent people that are attacking one another and bring peace to them. But we see what happens when that happens. Yes, evil is stopped, but free agency is eliminated as well. We see him later on. He's got a whole little bubble world going where
he's got his own cult.
He's got his own cult going. And to me, it helped. I thought this movie worked when it was introducing these kind of concepts and explaining philosophical questions we've all been asking for centuries, and gives us a little bit of insight. I mean, granted, it's an MCU movie. It's not going to go too deep, but it's those kind of things that I generally don't like these types of movies when it goes into just CGI battles. And for me, this is a pleasant respite of a philosophical musing.
Yeah, I mean, going back to your first point about as we were saying, it's like, why didn't they intervene, and how that information is handled and that situation is dealt with. I mean, I think this is a problem that you face all the time in a franchise series of movies like this. Whenever Captain America is fighting in one of his solo movies, it's always like, well, where's Iron Man? Yeah. Why isn't Spider-Man helping? Yeah. And similarly the other way around, when Spider-Man is wrestling with a villain who's way more powerful than he is, it's like, well, call the Avengers, come on, they're going to help. Or when you've got Captain Marvel, who is essentially sort of an all-powerful alien, and they're always wrestling with having to sort of these explanations of, oh, well, they're busy, oh, well, I think you have to, they've got other things to tend to, or he can do this one on his own, I wouldn't want to bother them.
I wouldn't want to bother.
I thought, yeah.
all of New York is in jeopardy, but
I got this. You're busy,
Superman's in the Caribbean with Lois Lane, and he's taking 2 weeks off.
But I felt,
don't call me.
I felt what was more glaring was sort of the flip side of that at the end of this, when the Eternals are literally facing a disaster that is in real time causing the entire world to break apart. And it hasn't attracted the attention of anybody else, of the Avengers or anything else. Whether they are communicating with one another or not, or just independently. This is purely something being faced and addressed by the Eternals. And you're like, okay, sure, this is an Eternals movie, and it would just get too complicated. But at the same time, and yes, after all that has come before, this is kind of like a leap of faith. Maybe a step too far. But moving on, I think. Like you said, yes, the bigger themes I think are what make this film more interesting. And
Yeah.
I think it does help that you've got such a sort of diversity of characters who are, who are immortal, who are super beings. This isn't an origin story
No.
in the traditional sense. This isn't about how someone got their powers. This is just about 10 people who all have powers already and know how to use them. It's not even about I've got to work out how to use this in a responsible way. They know exactly how to do it, and it's all like you said, a question of them dealing with the fact that they're not really supposed to use them. With great power comes great responsibility, as they say in Spider-Man.
And I love the convention, James, where whether it's vampires or Highlander, or anytime you have a being that has lived for centuries, I love when in the midst of a plot, you get a flashback to 500 years ago where they're interacting, and there's some moment that has an impact later. And this movie is kind of chocked with that because it kind of fills in some of the backstory of these characters. Because I think Chloe Zhao and the producers know that most people are not familiar with these characters, so they set up these little mini scenarios, flashbacks, so we get to see how their powers operate, how they interact with one another, who has this personality, who has this opinion. Because it's basically a family movie. It's a band movie, and then the band had its heyday. They break up, and then now we have to have a reunion tour, and we got to get the band back together, and that's essentially the plot of this movie.
Oh, sure. There's a real element of sort of the Blues Brothers or something like that to this movie, where it's like, okay, we've got to get the band back together. And a significant portion of the storytelling in the present day is them just going from one place to the next place, re-recruiting,
Right.
Former members who are for the most part, quite happy where they have landed and where they have settled.
Any get the band back together type plot line has to have the reluctant it's either that or it's the old 80s Arnold Schwarzenegger, where Arnold, even though we've got 450 Green Berets, nobody does it like you. Well, damn it, I'm not coming out of retirement. No, only you can do this. There's always that reluctance that's filtered into any plot. And we see some of the characters are like, hey, I've got a family now, or I've got a Bollywood career, which
that's great.
I thought was, we'll get to that, I'm sure, in a moment. But I thought the Bollywood character with his butler was one of the funniest aspects of the movie. And that's another thing to consider, is there's a lot of funny moments in this movie as well.
Yeah, and I do want to address those. But I felt that the film, as we've said, is like divided into sort of two parallel running stories, which is them putting the band back together, if you like, for the big final battle, but also flashing back to all these different periods of human evolution and seeing how they influence things. And you see this a lot in kind of like time travel movies, how they'll go back, do one thing anachronistic and how it sort of changes everything. But here they had the opportunity to kind of guide evolution in sort of real time as well. There's a real sort of sense of Chariots of the Gods about some of it, where they are essentially alien beings coming down and building pyramids or inspiring the natives to build pyramids or whatever, or to take that next step. So there's a bit of 2001 Space Odyssey in there as well, that they're coming in and going, no, this is how you make a steam engine.
I love that kind of thing. You referenced 2001, but you have Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life. You've got the Adjustment Bureau with Matt Damon. I love those kind of films, and Adjustment Bureau is one of my most rewatchable movies. I'll watch that movie anytime, and it's basically giving credence to the idea there's these angel type characters that don't interfere too much, but they just interfere enough to keep humanity from going off the rails. They have to maintain their free agency, but they're going to need some help. Otherwise you get the Dark Ages.
I think the other thing is that when you've got like a roster of characters who, for the most part, and I think even for a number of comic book fans, we don't really know who these characters are. And knowing the way that Marvel movies have worked in the past, and the way this kind of movie works in the past, we know that the deviants aren't the be-all and end-all when it comes to the threat. And when there is no real sort of final big bad, as they're called at the end, you kind of cotton on pretty early on, okay, there's going to be a rift in the Eternals, and they're going to end up, almost sort of Avengers Civil War style,
right?
Or more like the X-Men. For me, the Eternals reminded me more than anything else of the X-Men.
Yeah,
they are this sort of big extended family of people, all with competing powers, if you like. With no obvious leader, and it's all about, well, who's going to be on my side, who's going to be on your side. Are you going to use it for good, or are you going to use it for your own personal gain? And I felt that there was a lot of that going on. But for me, at least, I didn't know who was going to be, who was going to turn to the dark side, if you like.
Right.
And I think that they played on our expectations of that quite a bit. I think Barry Keoghan, for example,
right.
If you're familiar with his body of work, he's always a pretty kind of shifty, untrustworthy kind of guy.
He's got a face that kind of lends itself to that,
Yeah, he plays sort of twisted kids. If you've seen like Killing of a Sacred Deer, or by Yorgos Lanthimos, or films like that. I mean, he's in Dunkirk and he's fairly innocuous in that, but he's not to be trusted. If you put Barry Keoghan in your movie, you're like, keep an eye on that kid. He's going to do something. And I think they play with our expectations of that fairly well, whereas other more respectable, clean-cut actors who we have come to know as more, stoic, heroic figures are the ones who are swayed to use their powers in other ways.
I think I indicated to you after we saw the film, the clue I got that it was going to be Icarus' character that was going to I wasn't sure what was going to happen, but I knew something was going to happen, because this movie, you mentioned the diverse cast. I don't think I've seen a more diverse cast that really ticks nearly every diverse box you'd want to tick. And so there comes a point in the movie where Salma Hayek is dead. Gemma becomes the leader. The Cersei becomes the leader. She's a British Asian woman in real life. And I think a couple of the Eternals say at some point, no, you can't be the leader. It's got to be it's got to be Icarus. It's got to be the good-looking white guy. And I'm thinking, no way. Like in my head, I instantly thought, there's no way that this film, with the boxes that they're ticking, obviously for me, they're going to say, at the end of the day, when the shit hits the fan, we need the white cis male to lead us. Like I knew there's going to be some kind of thing where this guy's gonna.
That's not going to go well.
That's not going to get something. And I was proven right.
Sure, I mean, and there'll be some people who react to the diversity and the box ticking negatively, or cynically,
right?
But I think for the most part it was handled quite effectively and quite sensitively. You've also got Brian Tyree Henry's character, who it's revealed, without fanfare in any way, that he's gay.
Yes.
You've been watching half the film. You've been watching him for a good hour or so before they get to him, and he's settled down, and he's with his partner, and his partner is a guy, and they have a kid. And it's never addressed in those terms, and I think that's a good encouraging sign. I mean, it's low hanging fruit. It's a low bar, so it's a low bar, I should say.
Right.
But it's an encouraging that they are getting to that, and I think there are other characters as well, like is it Lauren Ridolph from Walking Dead, who plays the deaf character.
Right.
And again, it's never. I mean, yes, you see that she is deaf, and all the other characters know how to sign in order to communicate with her, but it's never addressed.
That was the only one that logically didn't make sense to me. I have no problem. I understand you want to diversify the cast, and I think the diversity actually lends itself. If you 7,000 years ago, if you're sending if a celestial being is sending a group, it's going to be brown people and black people and white. It's going to be all shades, and that works. I mean, and it was a good cast. I thought it was a strong cast. I thought introducing the deaf character, although she worked and she was fun to watch, and the interaction worked logically in my mind, I'm thinking, why would a celestial send just why do that? But
sure. I mean, no, you know what, that you are absolutely right. It would make sense that they would all be able to use sign language anyway.
Right.
without one of them having to be. You're right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It makes no sense. There's me with my my PC hat on far too tightly.
No. I totally concur. I love the idea of introducing a gay couple without making it the issue of the movie, or
Mhm.
making it almost like a culture war statement, like throwing down the gauntlet. We're going to show this. We know it's going to offend some people, but
Mm.
damn it, we're going to do it. I just loved that it was just totally natural. It was a loving couple with a kid. This is how human beings are. We fall in love, we raise families,
Yeah,
and
we have a nesting instinct.
right. And he wasn't the only one that had the nesting instinct. I mean, there's a few of them. I love Salma Hayek. She's out there in South Dakota on a farm, just enjoying.
She's like a cowgirl.
Nobody, yes, you know.
She's got her run. The couple I really like was Angelina Jolie and Don Lee.
Don
Ma
Lee,
Dong,
yeah.
Ma Dong Sok. Asian audiences will know him as Ma Dong Sok. He's a South Korean actor. You've seen him in Train to Busan. He was
Yes.
like he's scene stealer in Train to Busan. But he's grown up in the US as well and has an American name, which is Don Lee, that he uses internationally, and he's credited here as Don Lee. And that's a great relationship where it's not, those two go and settle together, but they're not a romantic couple, or at least it's not a two-way street. But
Yeah.
it's a very safe and nurturing and wholesome relationship, albeit a platonic one. But it's revealed that Gilgamesh, Don Lee's character, is in love with Thena, played by Angelina Jolie, and while it's not reciprocated romantically, they have become sort of codependent on one another in a way that that seems to satisfy both of their needs.
Right.
And I thought that was done really, really well.
And it was interesting. The two biggest names in the group of 10 is Salma Hayek and Angelina Jolie. And yet they really were background or secondary characters in that ensemble to, say, Gemma Chan.
Sure. I think Marvel are quite good at doing this cast-wise. I mean, if you go back and look right from sort of... Okay, let's not go right to the very beginning, but if you look at the likes of Thor, they cast two complete unknowns in Chris Hemsworth and Tom Hiddleston. They were nobodies when they were cast as Thor, but then they're surrounded by Anthony Hopkins and Rene Russo and Idris Elba, character actors who are, names unto themselves. And that, I think they've continued that. And I think the only exception was Robert Downey Jr., really. But he was such a gamble. He was so sort of toxic at the time.
Nobody knew whether MCU was even going to take off. That was 2008. Right. I mean, he launched the MCU. And I still hold the first Iron Man as probably my favorite superhero movie of the MCU universe. I just wanted to add about the cast. What I love too is those secondary characters. They almost all appeal to nerd culture. Like, they're not big names in themselves, but people in various nerd groups will know this person or that person or that. And I mean, even when Richard Madden and is it Kit Harington, Jon Snow, Richard Madden and Kit Harington, they occupy right at the beginning of the movie. They come on together. I'm thinking, well, that's the brothers. That's Rob Stark and that's Jon Snow. Like my Game of Thrones nerd glasses, nerdometer, or whatever the word. And I thought, that kind of stuff is done intentionally because it's fun, and it worked. It didn't seem convoluted or disjointed. It worked.
Well, yeah, no, it totally works, and I think that's what I'm getting at in terms of their casting. Is they tend to cast people who are on the cusp of stardom, or who have proven they've got the chops, dramatically or comedically or whatever, but aren't super expensive. Aren't necessarily a tentpole A-lister, and the MCU invariably makes them into A-list bona fide stars who can then go off and open their own movies on their name alone.
And, even Salma Hayek and Angelina Jolie, far from being wholly diminished, but they're probably not at the peak of where they were a few years ago. So it's a nice opportunity for them to shine in a bigger room again.
Absolutely. And you look at the precedents for that. Just going back one film, you got Tony Leung, who is it was amazing to see him get the opportunity to do that. You know, he's such a huge star in this part of the world,
right?
And then he brings that gravitas. There it is again.
There it is.
Yeah, we should have a bell that rings every time we
say gravitas. We'll figure something out. The gravitas. Who brings the gravitas in this film?
That's it. So you got Tony Leung, and then going back, you've got sort of Michael Douglas in Ant-Man. You've got, as I said, Anthony Hopkins in the Thor franchise. You've got Robert Redford came into Captain America. You know, they're really good at
Jeff Bridges in Iron Man.
Of course, yes, going all the way back to the very, very beginning of Jeff Bridges in the first film. You know, so they have such a long standing precedent. You know, so even though on the surface this in some ways seems slightly a different approach to this kind of material for the MCU. All of their signatures are really, you know, motifs are really sort of in place. One thing I think that does kind of work against it in this regard is because you almost have no human characters. You know, with the exception of Kinko's valet, you know, the sort of middle-aged Indian chap who comes along and provides a lot of the comic relief, and I think is probably the single funniest character in the film.
By a long shot. It was really funny.
All you've got is this roster of sort of super beings, if you like. And I think that because of that, and because none of them are sort of relatable humans, they all display relatable traits, or each of them has a single human trait with which they wrestle. From an audience point of view, you know, it's difficult to latch onto precisely who am I supposed to sort of sympathize with here? You know, who represents me on screen? And yes, like I said, you can recognize the independent struggles of these individuals in as much as the frustrations that drive Icarus to do, or the misplaced loyalties that drive Icarus to do what he does, or similarly what Drew faced, or any of the others. But what Marvel normally does is you have a human, everyday, normal world, and then there's one incredible super character who is invariably kind of a fish out of water, or dealing with not being normal anymore.
Right.
Surrounded by normal people who help drag them down or help understand the benefits and
can walk it out with them,
Right. Whereas here it's a little bit different. They're all. It's like following the jocks around and going, okay, who's, you know, and the nerds don't get a look in. And it's in that regard, I found it a little bit sort of emotionally detached,
right?
Somewhat, you know.
Right.
It's representing all the right things, but I think you know, if you were to ask me who was your favorite character, you know, who did you respond to most, I don't know, really. None of them, really, you know.
But I would see that as a positive, because I pretty much like them all. Like, if you ask me, just ask that question, I think, well, I really like this character, and I really like this character. I thought they were really well-rounded with differing opinions, differing aspirations, different loyalties. The whole idea of, you know, the authoritarian, that, hey, this is what you were created to do it, versus the free will question of no, after 7,000 years I've got my own agency now, I got a family, I got my own life. And I love those kind of ideas, and each one of those characters wrestles with that question on their own. We haven't even talked about Sprite yet. You know, Sprite is this character who is artificially kind of created as a 12-year-old. It harkens back to Kristen Dunst's character in Interview with a Vampire, where you're made a vampire at 12 years old. You haven't reached puberty yet, and you're this old soul stuck in a prepubescent body. She just wants to have sex with Icarus, and and she can't.
Pretty much. That's pretty much the be all and end all of it. And it does beg the question again: why would the Celestials do this? You know,
because we learn later the Celestials are not.
Well, I was going to say we're going to need to get to like the big reveal sooner or later.
Spoilers.
Yeah, big spoilers. Should we get into the spoilers then?
We might as well. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think just the last thing I was going to say to that is that I agree with what you're saying. I think, but I think the Eternals recognize that they cannot function independently, that they are only whole once they come together. And I think you realize very early on that because they each have a very different superpower, but they're also quite complementary, that you know that they can only complete their mission, if you like, and function properly if they are a team, if they remain together.
You know, and to jump off before we move into the spoilers, what you just said just activated something where one of the critiques I have, and I don't know a way around this per se. In fact, I would fall into this myself if I wrote the script. So it's not to besmirch the script writers, but one of the things that, like, say Highlander or even the Interview with the Vampire type movies is when they do those flashback sequences from modern day into the 1700s or whatever, you can see them dressing like the 1700s and using an inflection in their voice and some of the cadence of that time period. Whereas we have basically a group of 7,000-year-old immortals who are, whether they're in Samaria, Babylon, or modern London, they still are just wisecracking Anglo Brits. You know, they're ironic sarcasms. It relates to us, but in reality, they would not be talking to each other and relating in this kind of terminology. There's almost no. There's nothing given to the fact that maybe in Samaria they should act a little more Sumerian, or you know.
Right. I guess it's an easy shorthand to remind us constantly that they are outsiders and that they are different. But it's not. But it's almost like a time travel trope. You know, they're behaving like 21st century characters, you know, as they would if they had time traveled back there. But obviously they haven't. They have come from a complete other origin. And I think that leads nicely into one more thing before we get into spoiler territory, which is just the humor in general. And for me, by and large, I didn't like it. It felt very kind of crowbarred in. It felt that they had done like a final pass of the script. They had the script all there, and they were like, you know what, this is really kind of heavy and morose and grand and self-serious. We need some jokes in here. And also, I think, at the same time, they were like, we really need to connect this film better to the rest of the MCU. So it really felt like they'd just taken one pass right at the end and gone, okay, make a joke about Iron Man there. Okay, now make a joke about iPads there. Okay, now, you know, weirdly, you saw them make jokes about the DC universe as well. You know, there's a reference to Batman and there's a reference to Superman. And I was like, okay, that's a bit odd. And then someone's reading a Star Wars book at one point.
Well, that would make sense because they're owned by the same people.
That would make sense. Sure. And, you know, it makes sense, quote unquote, you know, and there are a couple of Apple jokes. But at the same time, it all felt a little bit... There's a BTS joke, for goodness sake.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
So all of that stuff for me felt a bit awkward. And I think it comes back to the point I was making earlier about these characters all being... not flawless, but being, you know, non-human and therefore difficult to relate to. The valet clowns around and makes the kind of gags that the rest of the MCU normally just make. You know, there's banter between them, and it feels more natural and more organic because it's human responses to things. You know,
right. And
for the most part, almost all, with the exception of sort of Thor or somebody, all of the MCU are or were human, normal humans, and have undergone a change or what have you, and so they've grown up with banter, essentially, and there's bickering between the Eternals, but it never felt that the jokes being made and the references being made to one another felt particularly natural,
right?
And so I found a lot of the comedy quite jarring and kind of, and you know what, maybe. And this is perhaps a little slightly low blow. Maybe Chloe Zhao's not the greatest director of humor or comedy in the world.
Well,
you know, I've seen her back catalogue, and it's very serious stuff for the most part.
Yeah. Nomadland was not a not a lot of comic relief in that one.
Right. You know, and just to mention Chloe Zhao's direction, I mean, she's great. She certainly brings her signature to the piece.
Right.
I think she really pushed Marvel to let her shoot on location a lot more than a typical MCU movie would do. We've all seen the behind-the-scenes shots of what it looks like to normally shoot an Avengers movie or something, and they're all just in a big studio on green screens. Here, she very obviously has traveled around the world to some of these locations, and it looks absolutely stunning, and the cinematography, and there is a kind of poetry to just how the world is presented, just as this beautiful, very naturalistic place, with the exception of, I think, London, and I think possibly one or two others. You don't see many cities. For the most part, you just see like the great expanses of the outdoor world, and it's and that's a very Chloe Zhao trait as well. You know, she's a country bumpkin in that regard. You know, she's not a city girl. Put it that way.
Yeah, and even though the final CGI battle was not a city being destroyed, it was out in the middle of nowhere. That battle
was
happening.
A volcano. It was a volcano, wasn't it? Right. So should we get into spoilers then?
Yeah. Let's do it. Let's. Who's the good? Who's the bad?
Well, okay. Let's address the big spoiler, which is the about halfway through the revelation that the Eternals discover that they are not who they thought they were. Yeah. They are not immortal beings sent down by the Celestials for a noble cause. You know, they are essentially robots who are sent to keep the deviants in check, who were also created by the Celestials, in order to facilitate the emergence, to help the world's human population grow, who are essentially being used as an energy source, almost Matrix style, because the Earth itself is a cocoon,
a big egg,
a placenta, not placenta, an amnion, in which another Celestial is being born. And the great conundrum that they are faced with is the Earth is going to explode, essentially. It's going to be destroyed in 7 days because the emergence is happening. A new Celestial is being born. But that sacrifice will in turn benefit hundreds of millions of possible worlds and billions of lives going forward, because that Celestial will go on to create all kinds of new life. And so it's weighing up essentially the lives of the many against the lives of the few, but the potential lives of the many against the very real lives of the few. Are you willing to sacrifice the Earth for the sake of an entire new galaxy, essentially? And some of them go, well, yes. And some of them go, well, no.
Not unlike real society, because there's a very real underlying theme that's played out in that.
So there's a number of themes. So the argument for just doing what they're doing is like, well, we are following orders. Our leader, what's his name? The big
time it's what's coming.
Arishem, the big Celestial, this is what we are put here to do. Whether he created us or whatever is irrelevant. He put us here to follow his orders and to do this. This is our duty. This is our destiny. This is the right thing to do. But then there are another, and think of all the millions and billions of lives that will be created, and the evolution that will happen, and the greater good,
right?
Essentially. Whereas there are others who are like, well, hang on a minute. We have lived our lives, quote unquote, so far, protecting the human race. How can we continue to protect the human race, knowing that in 7 days they're all going to die? Particularly when a number of us have very intimate personal relationships with individuals in the human race. The right thing to do is to stop this from happening, to destroy this new Celestial, dare I say, terminate this pregnancy before it comes to term, for the greater good. And so, yes, that can be interpreted in a number of ways, not least the one I just alluded to.
James is less than subtle.
It's a pro-choice movie.
It's very pro-choice.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sitting there at the end of this movie going, hang on a minute, what is this, if not essentially sort of asking the question? And the film, I think, is very balanced in the way that it addresses it. It admits, okay, let go with me just for a moment on this. So it basically admits, abortion is not a great idea ever. You know, it's always a very, very difficult decision to make. However, there are certain circumstances in which it's the lesser of the two evils, if you like. You know, you can say this is an unwanted, an unplanned pregnancy. You know, nobody other than the Celestials knew what was happening, knew that this was going on, and when they realized it, this will ruin many lives if it comes to term. I mean, in the same way that an unwanted pregnancy could ruin the life not only of the mother but of a number of people surrounding it, or drastically change it. Be welcomed into a world that is unprepared to deal with it, and what have you. However, and there is a sensible, some might consider sensible choice to be made, which is it's better off for everybody to nip this in the bud, don't do this, and to maybe plan something better in the future.
Right.
And the argument against will always be, well, life has already begun, and think of the potential. That unborn child might go on to cure cancer, might create new vaccines, blah blah blah. Could just become the almighty powerful being. Could be the second coming. You never know. It could be anything. It's like, and that's always the argument against. And I felt that the character of Sprite has a very interesting voice in this part of the conversation, because she is on the side of letting this celestial be born, destroying the earth. And she says to Cersei, who is essentially, Cersei is the Eternal in whose lap this responsibility has fallen to make this choice or not. She says, I've never had the experiences that you've had. I've been stuck in the body of a young girl my entire life. You have the love of Icarus. You have the love of other men. You have lived your life to the full. I have never had that opportunity, and is essentially sort of. I felt she's talking from the point of view of women who want to become pregnant but are struggling to.
Right. Yes, that's a powerful metaphor there. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's like, it's your responsibility to have this child. Essentially, whether you will then put it up for adoption, because I'll adopt it because I want one, and I can't have one. And I felt that that was a very strong argument that she was laying forth there. But ultimately, that's what the film is about, and ultimately, the decision is made for them to stop what's happening, because it's a Marvel movie and you've got to save the Earth at the end.
Yeah, and you got to have a CGI battle at the end. And
you got to have a big CGI battle, yeah.
I thought, though, as CGI battles go, because this is where I usually fall off of a superhero movie, and this is why I tend to zone out the second half when the CGI battles really get going. I remember going to see the original Captain America. In the first 25% of that movie, I thought, oh, this is a great story. I'm getting to see in my eyes the origin story of Captain America. And then it turned into just a CGI fest. I thought this movie was interesting because the whole dynamic of Tiamat coming alive in the hands coming up out of the ocean, I just found visually stunning. I thought it was something. It really looked great. It was on a scale that we haven't always seen. I mean, the problem with CGI battles, how many times can you see Superman throw General Zod through a building, and it gets it's like car chases. It gets boring. But every once in a while,
the sky beams at the end of MCU movies, yeah.
But every once in a while, a baby driver comes or a road warrior comes and reinvents what a car chase can be. I thought I wouldn't put this CGI battle on that level, but to me, it introduced some things going on, some conflicts going on that made it at least somewhat compelling for a guy who's usually bored with this to find interesting.
It definitely does a good job, I think, of making it visually interesting. And I think that the weight that they put on the decision to be made really helps. These are incredible stakes. I mean, we have seen, numerous invasions of faceless robotic armies or alien armies, in these MCU movies. And this was something very different. There was no army of drones that had to be sort of mown down. There
were some dogs, some CGI dogs,
And this was something that, even if they were to sort of stop it, the impact on the Earth had to a degree already been started. So there's a definite the climate change message in there as well, because it's all for obvious reasons, because it's all about just like the impact that it's making on the planet. And I felt that Chloe Zhao did a great job of representing that in a sort of visually interesting and unique way for an MCU movie. Because I mean, I think that the fights you see at the beginning against deviants and stuff, you're like, yeah, okay, but this looks like a Marvel movie. I hope it's not going to be 2.5 hours of this, and it wasn't 2.5 hours of that.
No, it was 2.5, more than 2.5 hours though. My concern, not concern, but my question is, where do you go from this? Because the Avengers kind of took incremental steps to get to the Thanos, to get to the whole Earth is in jeopardy. For the Eternals, I know they want this to be, I keep saying the Eternals. There's no the for There's Eternals. No. For Eternals, obviously they want this to be a franchise. They want to have sequels. And this is where, like, even TV shows like Star Trek Discovery is starting to run into this issue of, once you've scaled up the consequences and the arena and what you're actually saving, after you've saved the universe, scaling everything back down to something that's a little smaller, it seems too reductive. And so how does Eternals go forward now? They've already saved, what do they got to save the universe now? To me, it gets too grandiose, where sometimes those smaller stories are the more interesting.
Sure. I mean, for good or ill, we definitely know that there is a grand plan in place for the MCU, and that they have, we've got 4 Marvel movies coming out next year alone. The first of which, you got Spider-Man coming out in Christmas, but the first of which next year is Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. So we already know, thanks to films like Guardians of the Galaxy and even Avengers Endgame and films like sort of Doctor Strange and Ant-Man, we know that they want to go beyond Earth. They want to go into space, into the galaxy, but also into the multiverse. This idea that there are, numerous simultaneous realities taking place. And once you've got that, then you can go bigger, you can go smaller, and everything has ripples.
It just hit me, James, and you and I've got to write this script and come up with a log line before anyone else thinks of this. But now that Disney owns Marvel and Star Wars, and they're going into space, we can combine. We can have Thor and Iron Man fighting alongside Luke Skywalker and the gang. This
Mickey Mouse.
And Mickey Mouse is
Marvin
there.
I know he's
Pluto,
Warner Brothers, I think.
Pluto's by the fireplace.
I think if you go to Disneyland, that's already happening.
Yeah.
I think they're already sort of mixing up those factors. And I'm not overly protective of any of them, but I get very twitchy when that kind of thing starts happening, because I'm like, it's almost like, is nothing sacred? Yeah. There have to be some walls to this reality. And they've already started breaking down those walls. Because I was thinking about this, and we've actually mentioned these elements already, but I haven't really addressed this, is, in a Marvel movie, someone was reading a Star Wars book. Mm-hmm. So does that mean that the Star Wars movies exist in the MCU, or that Star Wars exists, as you're suggesting, in the MCU? Also, they talk about Batman and Superman. So do Batman and Superman exist in the same way that Iron Man and Thor exist in the MCU? Or are they comic book characters?
Right.
Are they movie characters? So there's a whole lot going on that has yet to be.
My advice is, in the eternal words of Bill Murray in Ghostbusters, don't cross the streams.
Yeah, I honestly do believe that. But Marvel has precedents for crossing the streams. They love nothing better than to do one of these big mashups where everybody teams up and they cross-pollinate and all the rest of it. So we'll see. In terms of where do they go from here, we know, in as much as we know what films are coming. Mm-hmm. Do we know what's happening in those films? Not really, and they're always very good about revealing it. The trailers for MCU movies are always very well done, I think, because it looks like they're showing you a lot,
right?
And then very quickly, when you sit down and actually watch the movie, you realize that everything they've shown you was in like the first 10 minutes of the movie. Mm-hmm. Even though it looks like big final battles and banter, and it's like no, this all happens right at the start. You don't know what's going to happen in this. And so we've got Doctor Strange coming. We've got more Black Panther.
Let me just say,
more Thor coming.
My irritation with Doctor Strange is it's keeping Benedict Cumberbatch away from what he should be doing, and it's season 5 of Sherlock.
Okay, that's interesting. That's another discussion, because I think personally Sherlock has kind of jumped the shark somewhat. But hey, that's just me.
Oh, that hurts. That hurts. But
well, we can discuss it when it happens.
Yeah.
So I mean, what was interesting is I don't know where it's going. I mean, I know, like I said, I know there's more Doctor Strange, Black Panther. There's the Marvels, which is a sequel to Captain Marvel, but is obviously in the name itself suggesting that it's broadening the scope. We've got more Thor, more Ant-Man, more Guardians. All of this stuff is in various stages of production. There's another Captain America with what's his name, Falcon as
oh right, yes.
now taking over Anthony Mackie.
Yes.
So we know all of that is happening. So we know, but we don't know sort of really what's happening at all. I mean, I thought it was interesting how the film ends, how Eternals ends, where you've got essentially the Eternals sort of splitting up. You know, the band splits up again, and some of them go off into space, and some go
into the sun.
Yeah, well, I thought that was a nice little kind of full circle element, because Icarus obviously gets his name from, you know, the legend of Daedalus and Icarus, the Greek myth, and that is referenced in the film. Right. And Icarus has a nice throwaway line where he's just like, "Oh yeah, Sprite just made that up," you know, in ancient Greece, just as because she tells these great stories of mythology. She weaves a lot of the mythology, and then it ends with him, you know, taking this honorable decision and literally flying himself into the sun. And I was like, oh, that's a nice little ending for him.
Yeah,
you know, that's a kind of perfect way for him to go.
Poetic.
And then you have these 2 post-credit sequences.
Oh yes.
You know, which I had to look up afterwards. I was like, I don't know what.
Same.
But I did look it up.
Yeah.
So the first one is you've still got a couple of the Eternals on the ship, and they're flying off into space. And Harry Styles materializes, and a CGI troll or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
And he is Eros, and his troll is called Pip, and they are related, I think, to
Thanos. Isn't he the brother of Thanos or something like
right.
that?
He's Thanos' little brother. Because Thanos, I believe, originally is also a creation of the Celestials, in the same way that the Eternals are a creation of the Celestials.
Right.
So I think they all exist on a similar plane.
So we have the Celestials to blame. Blame God, you know.
Essentially, blame God.
Blame God. I
thank God and blame him in equal measure. Yes.
It's interesting when Harry Styles popped in for the end credit cameo, because I am not a One Direction fan. I'm vaguely aware of Harry Styles. And so I vaguely recognized a guy that I think I know. But when I heard all the hoots of girls in the cinema, I went, okay, I really should know this guy. And then it dawned, oh, that's Harry Styles. Okay.
Right.
I went through the Rolodex in my mind really fast with Harry Styles.
And it's amazing how much particularly in this film, it's amazing how much Richard Madden, and Kit Harington all look like they could be related.
Yes. You know? Yeah. Well, they're all Brits.
They are. They're all Brits, and they're all, well, not exactly the same age. Harry Styles is younger, but
and you're Brit too, because you could join that. You're indistinguishable. You're indistinguishable from those.
I'm at least as good looking as
that's it. That's it.
But you know, particularly in those early scenes where, you know, Gemma Chan is wrestling between Kit Harington and Richard Madden, I was like, well, she definitely has a type.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
It's like, yes, you could pretty much interchange between these 2 guys. And then, okay, so then moving to the very, very final post-credits scene, which had kind of thrown me, because about halfway through the film, we see Angelina Jolie playing with Excalibur at one point. She's just swinging this broadsword around, and he's like, oh, what's that? And she's like, it's Excalibur. And I was like, okay, fine. And then Dane, who's Kit Harington's character, had already alluded to the fact that his family has a long and dark history.
Yeah, there's a little foreshadowing going on there.
But he hadn't had a chance to actually explain what it is. And then you see, and he's there, and he has this sword, which I believe is called the Ebony Blade. And I looked at his character. It's always good when you look on the Eternals Wikipedia page and character names have a link. You're like, oh, okay, that means they're an important character with backstory.
Right.
So And so he is one iteration of a character called the Black Knight, who at one point led the Avengers in the comic books.
Oh.
So I think he is actually going to become a fairly significant character. He is a descendant of, I think it's Sir Percy, one of the Knights of the Round Table, essentially. And for
maybe the Angelina Jolie having Excalibur was a little foreshadowing.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Who knows?
Or just a little play. You never know what's going to be a playful throwaway and what's not. But the character Black Knight is definitely a significant character in the MCU, and has always been tied in with the Avengers and tied in with the Eternals, and they have a long history. So we shall see. And I believe, yes, I read that at one point he actually led the Avengers.
Interesting.
So that is interesting.
Well, James, we're drawing to a close. Any final thoughts and final score?
This is sort of an interesting one for sure, because it was the first time in a long time that I really didn't know what I was coming into, and I did know that a lot of the early reviews of the film had been a little bit sniffy and dismissive. I will also admit that Chloe Zhao didn't seem like the obvious choice to direct a Marvel movie.
No.
Particularly one as big and epic as this, which is clear. I mean, this is clearly an important piece in the puzzle of what's going forward. It's clearly a big sort of foundation slab in Phase 4 and beyond of the MCU. And it's a risky proposition because it has all these characters that we just don't know. We are unfamiliar with. I was surprised that at no point did any existing MCU characters pop up.
Right.
That I noticed. I was expecting it, at the very least, in the credit sequences, they would connect with somebody,
right?
Be it Doctor Strange or whomever. But there's none of that. So it suggests to me, oh no, this is going to, at least for the time being, be its own thing, like the Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yes. Yeah.
And I got a bit. So I came in with no expectations, certainly no baggage. Aware that people had been sniffy about it, but I had an open mind. And yes, it's long and it's unwieldy, and I felt there is a sort of emotional disconnect, and it felt a bit disjointed in places. There was a lot to appreciate, I think. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being one of the less successful financially Marvel movies, just because it
doesn't have the big characters that we're familiar with.
It is so sort of
Spider-Man, and I didn't. I wouldn't have gone to the cinema to see this, other than are doing reviews. I would have waited to see this on streaming when it came out.
Okay, I'm glad I saw it in the big screen, and we saw it in IMAX, because it does look gorgeous. It really does.
And same. I'm pleasantly surprised. I enjoyed this movie far more than I thought I would.
Yes. Well, I want to say that there's far more in this movie that I enjoyed. If that's
that might be a better way. Actually, that might be a better way of saying it, considering where I'm at. But should we say I've deviance, or do you got another rule?
Let's say, well, I'm gonna give it whatever it is. I'm gonna give it a 3.
You're gonna get, we're too close. I'm gonna give it 3.5 because I think I liked it a little you did. I liked it more than our last week's. I gave last Soho a 3, and I gave this a 3.5. Let me close by saying, though, bringing up Last Night in Soho, the movie starts in London again. I think and after watching London in Last Night in London in Eternals, I'm really missing London. I've got to get this COVID. I'm getting tired of it, and I want to go to there.
I felt exactly the same. I felt that the locations chosen in Eternals in London were really well picked out, and they were parts of London that I would go to, and or felt very much like home. It wasn't just here's Big Ben and here's St. Paul's. It was like neighborhoods that I was like, okay, yeah, this feels like the London that I go to.
Right.